I read 13 books in January, and in this video I'm going to be giving you a review of each one. Let's get into it. The first book that I read in January was The Great Alone by Kirsten Hanna. This book follows a young girl named Lenora who grows up with both of her parents. Her father, however, went to the war in Vietnam, and ever since he's come back, he's been a very changed man. He's been very erratic, and he decides he wants to take his family to Alaska. So at the beginning of this novel, they move to Alaska and they become homesteaders, which is a very big change for a little girl who grew up in Seattle. But soon after they arrive there, things start to get dark, as they do in Alaska, but also her father's mental state rapidly descends into darkness. So you're dealing with some family issues here, but then also just like the roughness of living in Alaska. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. It actually made me cry, which is kind of a feat in itself because I do not cry very often in books at all. It takes a lot to make me cry. I really like the atmosphere of this book, not just like the rough beauty of Alaska, but also like the growing tension as Alaska started to get darker and her father started to get darker in mood. I think that like she did a really good job at creating that tension and like that build up. I like the story overall, but I did end up taking off a star and a half or so, just because I feel like the last 100 pages were very convenient, honestly. I can't go into it without spoiling anything, but just the way that things wrap up, it's like, okay, you're pretty lucky for that. Like, most people would not be in that situation. So again, it just felt very convenient. And I also just felt like Hannah was trying to pull at your heartstrings in any way imaginable, which I mean, it did work on me, clearly, because I cried, but it does feel like it cheapens the plot a little bit when you feel like that, so that's why I didn't end up giving this a higher rating. But again, overall, I still enjoyed this. Let me giving this to my mom, because I think my mom's gonna have a great time with this. This is definitely a mom book. And then I finished a monster of a book, and that is Brandon Sanderson's Wind and Truth. This is the 5th book in the Stormlight Archive, so I can't really give you a description, and I honestly can't really give a description of the Stormlight Archive either, just because it's a very hard series to describe. I will say this is like a high fantasy series. It's set in a world that's ravaged by storms. You're following a big group of people, honestly. In the first book, though, you're following, let's see, I'm trying to remember where the characters are in the first book, because it's been a while. You're following the general of like this nation, you're following a scholar turned thief, and you're also following a soldier who is now a slave, and all their stories kind of coalesce and come together at a certain point in the book. And like, I hate even giving that description because I feel like it doesn't adequately summarize the book. Really, what I say for the Stormlight Archive is that if you like high fantasy, you just have to read it. You just have to read it. You have to. You've got no choice in the matter. But into this book, it takes a lot of skill to keep a reader entertained for 1,300 pages. 1,300 pages. It takes even more skill for those 1,300 pages to be completely action-packed. Like, there was not a slow moment in this book. It kept you on the edge of your seat the entire time. And honestly, like, I keep exaggerating how many pages are in this book, but I'm getting tired just holding it right now. I do say, like, I wish I had read the prior books before picking this up, but I don't think that you have to. Like, I was able to eventually get in the swing of things. It just took me a little bit longer delving into it to remember what happened in the previous books. And I'm honestly sure that there's a lot that I'm missing because there's 4 previous books that were just as long as this one. So I cannot remember every detail. I did have to go on Wikipedia and read the synopses of the other books, like the summaries at least. And I don't know how much I retained from that, but I do think that like once you get into this book, it's like a swift go along, if that makes any sense. I don't know what those words mean, they just came out of me. And honestly, I just can't say much about this book without spoiling anything. But just, it's like the best high fantasy series that has ever existed. Like, genuinely my favorite high fantasy series ever. Perfect series. If you like high fantasy, you just have to read it. Don't be alarmed by the size. If you like fantasy, this is the series for you. I didn't even say how many stars I gave it. I gave it 5 stars, obviously. It's Brandon Sanderson, and it's the Stormlight Archive. After that, I picked up Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. This is a Hercule, I don't know how to say his last name, Poirot mystery. So this is like in one of her main series. It's like right in the middle of it. It's like book 10 or something. But you don't need to read them in order. Although I do think that after this one, I'm gonna want to go back and read them in order because that's just the kind of reader I am. But anyway, This book essentially takes place on a train. The detective Hercule Poirot, if that's how you say his name, is on the train. And one night, someone is killed. And previously, before this man had asked the detective if he could be like a bodyguard or figure out who was trying to kill him, because this man knew that someone was coming for him. And then that night, he's killed. So, it's like a locked room mystery because the train has stopped before this. They're caught in snow, so they can't go anywhere. They didn't make any of the stops that they were supposed to. So the train is just like stopped, and he's trying to figure out who the murderer is because it has to be someone on the train. Because due to the conditions, they would have known if it was like an outsider. And due to the conditions, the murderer couldn't have escaped. So that's essentially the gist of it. I think I'm the odd one out with this one because I didn't completely love it, and I feel like all the reviews on Goodreads are like, wow, this is the best mystery I've ever read, and I just wasn't in that boat. I did enjoy it. I definitely want to read more Agatha Christie, but it did lack a certain ick factor for me. Not ick, it factor. I found it interesting, but it didn't really pull me in. I did like really want to know who the murderer was though, but I'm not gonna spoil the ending, but upon the ending, it's like there's no way in hell I could have guessed that. So that kind of ruins it a little bit for me just because it was absolutely impossible for me to figure out on my own. There's also another kind of weird thing in here where there are a lot of ethnic stereotypes. Like, the detective is talking it over with like the guy who owns the train and then some other guy aboard the train. I forget who he was. But they're like discussing it amongst themselves and they're like, it was a crime of passion, it had to be a Latin. And it's like, what? What do you mean? And then another guy's like, no, it was a cold, calculated murder. It had to be an Englishman. And it's like, what? It just seems really silly to be a detective and to be like using that as a basis to figure out who committed the crime. Doesn't seem like a great technique. But that's just me. I think it's also just shows like the age of this book though, because I don't really, maybe people thought more like that back then. But I don't really think most people, I don't really think like that today, especially like detectives wouldn't be like, oh, it has to be an Englishman. So I thought that was weird. Regardless, I don't really have anything to say that points towards this being a bad book. I think it's definitely an enjoyable one. It just didn't feel groundbreaking to me, which I was kind of expecting based off of like the notoriety of the book and the author, but maybe that was a little bit unfair. Oh, and I did give this book 3 stars. After that, I finished reading The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. This book is crazy. This is a nonfiction book. It talks about the Great Migration, which if you don't know, I always have to look at the back to get the dates. But it's from 1915 to 1970. There was basically like a mass exodus of Black Americans from the South to the North and the West. And Isabel Wilkerson interviewed like 1,200 people to get their own like unique stories of their lives. And this book centers around 3 specifically, and it basically tells the story of their lives, like growing up in Jim Crow South towards their eventually leaving and what their experiences were in the North and West. This is an amazing book. I highly recommend this. I took my sweet time reading it. I read it over the course of like a month or 2 probably, but it was so worth it. I would really love to read the stories that weren't in this book, but I do understand her decision to just limit it to 3, because those 3 really like encapsulated the time in the Great Migration. And I gave this book 5 stars. My favorite part of this book is that it reads like a novel. Like, even though it's non-fiction, you're following the story of these people's lives, so it almost feels like you're following fictional characters. And it really reminded me of like being little and my grandma telling me the stories of her youth, which I really loved at the time. I've also always been partial to qualitative research in general. That's just who I am as a social sciences girl. But I will say, I just think this book in particular is so important. Like, it talks about not only growing up Black in America, but it talks about like our history. And I think that we as Americans, at least, have this tendency to talk about slavery and its after effects as if it's so far in the past. But reading this, like, my dad was alive during Jim Crow. He was only like 2 by the end of it. So he wasn't like old, but my dad like lived through Jim Crow. It's not a very far back experience. Like, the whole time I was reading this, I was just thinking about how these people were alive at the same time as my grandparents, but just had such different lived experiences. Like, obviously I'm a white woman, my grandparents are also white, so they didn't experience racism in America. But overall, I think this book is just such an important book to read to understand like Black history in America. And I think it really opens your eyes because it's like, Especially there's people who think that racism is like solved ever since Barack Obama was president, you know, like crazy people. But I think this book really shows like the lasting impact of slavery and racism and like how its effects are still being felt today. I just think it's such an important read. Like I honestly think people should be reading this in school. And like don't be intimidated by the size because it's a really, really easy read at the same time. I absolutely love this. 5 stars, an amazing book. I had so many 5 stars this month, guys. It's crazy. Then I picked up Burning Wood, which I don't have with me because I immediately gave it to my friend to read. And that's because this book was another 5 star, if you can believe it. I am someone who is so picky with my 5-star reads that it's crazy to me. Like, I think I only had like maybe under 10 5-star reads the whole of last year, and already this month I had 3. That's wild. Like, I can't believe I gave this book 5 stars, but I did. And for most of the book, it was hovering at like a 3 or a 4, but the ending really, really sold me. So essentially, this book is following a guerrilla gardening collective named Burnham Wood. At the beginning of the novel, there's a landslide in a part of like rural New Zealand that kind of cuts off that part of New Zealand from the busier cities next to it. So the founder of the guerrilla gardening collective, Burnham Wood, decides it would be perfect for them to go down there and guerrilla garden. So she goes down there, and when she's there, she meets this billionaire American who made his money in surveillance. And he doesn't own the property, but he is like about to purchase it from the owners. And she's like, shit, like he's gonna tell them that I'm here. But instead, he's like, no, you stay here. You stay here, I'm not gonna tell them a word. And from there on, it just gets crazy. Like, this is another one where I hate giving the description of it because it does not encompass the book at all. Like, shit gets so crazy, I can't even explain to you how crazy this book gets. The back of the book described it as like Shakespearean in its drama, and I completely agree. This book. You gotta pick it up. You gotta pick it up. Another one you need to read. It just gets wild so fast. Like, you wouldn't expect it to go the places that it goes, but it goes there. The first 2/3 of the book are much slower. They kind of are more about building up the characters. So you meet the people behind Burnham Wood. They're having a lot of like discussions about morality under capitalism and like leftist organizing and stuff like that. And I think that for some people that part of the book can be boring, but as someone who's frequently in leftist circles, it just felt like necessary conversations to have. I hate saying that because it's like I don't spend time with my friends being like, oh, how do we be more onto capitalism? But I kind of do at the same time. I don't know what that says about me. But I just felt that the debates that the characters were having were really relevant and important. And I think that the author really spends this time of the book building up these characters so you understand like their political allegiances, and you also understand them as people because they're all really fleshed out like a real person would be. Which, like, I hate giving props to an author for doing that, but sometimes authors just can't do that, so you really do have to point it out when it happens. These are all, like, fully formed people that you're reading about. And building them up in this way, and so that you know the characters in this way, just makes the last third of the book even more captivating, and that's when shit hits the fan. I'm not gonna say anything that happens, even though I desperately want to discuss this. Please, if you've read this book, discuss it with me in the comments, because I'm going crazy. My friend hasn't picked it up yet, and I need someone to talk to about it. Like, after stuff started happening, I just could not put it down. And when I got to the last page, I was shocked to find out that it was the last page, and I literally, like, exclaimed. And then, when I finished the book, I just had to lay down and stare at the ceiling. Like, I love a book that makes me do that, and I think this book is going to stay with me for a very long time. I had a feeling, at least, that I was going to like it. I did not know that I would love it, and this book is definitely going to be a favorite of the year. I can already say that. It's only January. Oh my god. Well, it's February now, but still. And then, you're not going to believe it, another 5-star. This is Asada, an autobiography by Asada Shakur. This basically tells her life story. If you don't know, Asada Shakur was a Black Panther. She's a Black revolutionary. And this story tells her life story. I didn't just say it like that. But essentially it takes place in 2 parts. One starts from the moment that she was arrested on the New Jersey Turnpike and kind of like the trial that happened. So if you don't know anything about Asada, she was indicted and kept in a New Jersey prison, and then she escaped and made her way to Cuba. So, very interesting story. And the other half tells her story from like a young child to growing up and becoming more radical to the point of the New Jersey Turnpike. I've owned this autobiography for a while, and I've been meaning to pick it up for ages. And what made me pick it up is that I read Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis, and she mentioned about how Asada to this day is on like the US like most wanted list, which is fucking crazy. Fucking crazy. I hate this country. But that made me really want to pick this up, and I'm so glad that I did. Overall, I feel like I learned a lot from this, not just about Asada and her life, but also about growing up in Black in America and about Black revolutionary thought. This was the first book I've read about a Black Panther, and I can't wait to read more. I just feel like that's an area of my reading where I'm very like uneducated in and need to learn more about. But I really love the parts of this where she talked about her experiences in the party and particularly her critiques of it, and I would just love to read more about that so I can form my own opinions. But my favorite part of this book is just how inspiring it was. Like, Asada was such a fucking amazing, inspirational woman. Well, she's still alive. Let me make that clear. It's just clear from reading this how she always stuck to her principles, and I think that is just so incredible because so many people don't do that. But she put her principles first in like every single situation. She was also just so fucking intelligent. Like, it's clear from this book that she was reading constantly, not just the typical Marx and Lenin, but also Ho Chi Minh, Kim Il-sung, Fidel Castro. I don't know why I said it like that. And she was also reading other revolutionary leaders that I'd never even heard of, which is so exciting because it gives me more people to read about myself. But on top of being really educational and inspiring, this book was also so funny. And I just thought it was amazing how she balanced these more like light-hearted moments with like the darkness in this book. Because obviously she was like framed for murder and she was arrested and she was in jail for a very long time. And when she was in jail, she was like commonly isolated, and I just can't imagine like what this woman has actually been through. But then there were moments where she was talking about like but there were moments where she was talking about like being with white Marxists and stuff, and I have to read you this quote. She was talking about how these white Marxists were critiquing the Viet Cong engaging in peace talks, and she went, "I think they got insulted when I asked them how a group of flabby white boys who couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag had the nerve to think they could tell the Vietnamese people how to run their show." And then there's also another moment where she's talking about how like the Black community really showed up for her during her trial, and she shares the story of a little girl in the courtroom saying, "Is that the fascist pig, mommy?" while pointing at the judge. And like those things were having me dying. Like, and I just think again, like her balancing these elements while like having a very serious book about these terrible things that happened to her is just incredible. I just felt so many emotions when reading this book. I even cried at the end, which again, like I know I already said that I cried at a book in this video, so it doesn't seem like I don't cry often at books, but I don't cry often at books. Like, it takes a lot. And I was just so happy for her at the end of this book that I cried, which is another thing. I don't cry when I'm happy. That's wild. Ultimately, I don't have any critiques of this. This is just a perfect book, I have to say. The one thing I would say, which isn't even a critique, is that I wish she talked a little bit in a foreword or something about some of the choices she made when writing this book. Like, for instance, like when she wrote like America or courtroom, instead of a C, she would have a K. I understand that. I also understand why she did it. I also do understand why she didn't capitalize like New Jersey or United States, but she also frequently didn't capitalize the word I. And I don't know why she did that, and I kind of like, I tried to look into it and couldn't find anything, so I would have loved to just learn her reasons behind that, but regardless of that, it's a perfect book and I loved it. Then after that, I picked up Pew by Catherine Lacey. This is a curious little book that I'm not sure I completely understood. So essentially, this book takes place in a Southern American town, and one day, a church congregation finds someone sleeping on a pew. They are seemingly genderless, racially ambiguous, and no one is sure of their age. But then one of the members of the church decides to take them in, and from there everyone in the community becomes involved, and they name them Pew, hence the title of the book, because they don't speak to anyone. That's another thing. They won't talk to anyone, so no one can even like get answers out of them as to their gender, race, or age. So I'm not totally sure what to make of this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I did like it, but I feel like there were things that I just didn't understand. I was able to pick up on some themes of like white saviorism and critiques of organized religion, but I think those are like easy things to pick up on. Like, I'm not giving myself any credit for that. I think this book also spoke a lot about how people react when they're faced with something that doesn't fit into their preconceived notions of the world, like something they can't easily categorize. While I enjoyed these themes, I just felt very distant from the character of Pew. Like, I didn't totally understand their thoughts and the things they were saying. It just felt very like ambiguous, which I guess kind of goes into the whole theme of the book. Overall, I do think it's a good book. I just wish I understood it a bit more, but I think this is one I'm going to keep to reread at some point, and maybe I'll like understand it better then. I don't know. Then, after Pew, I picked up Down Below by Leonora Carrington. This book I gave 2 stars. So this is a nonfiction book. Leonora Carrington is essentially like a very famous surrealist painter, and she at one point was in a relationship with another famous painter named Max Ernst. But they were living in France, and the Germans invaded and put him in a concentration camp. And so she escaped France, went to Spain, but she went insane, and she was put into a psychiatric hospital. And this book is about her experiences while she was in the psychiatric hospital. I was really looking forward to this one, partially because it's an NYRB book, and I really want to read more by that publisher, and also just because I thought it sounded really interesting. Like, I thought it was going to be very like emotional, and I was excited to read about someone's experience in one of those hospitals because I've actually been in one myself. So I just thought maybe I could relate, even though obviously this is like way back in time, not like the modern amenities that I had in a behavioral health unit. But I imagine this book would be like deeply emotional, and I wanted to learn about that lived experience. But it just ended up being like very fever dreamish, which isn't something I like in a book. Like, I couldn't really hold on to anything she was saying. It felt very confusing, and I imagine that was partially the point. Like, she's not necessarily supposed to be making sense, you know? But I just couldn't really enjoy the book because of that, because I was just confused the whole time. And again, maybe that's the point, to make you feel as the same as she felt during that time period, but I just didn't like it. So, this was a disappointment. After that, I picked up If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. This book takes place in South Korea, and it follows 4 women who are living in the same apartment building. It follows Ara, who's a hairdresser and is mute. It follows Kyori, who works at like a room salon. It follows Miho, who's a talented artist with a rich boyfriend. And then finally it follows a woman named Wana, who just moved into the apartment building with her husband and has just gotten pregnant. I feel like this book has a lot of interesting things to say about beauty standards and like the experience of women in South Korea as a whole, as well as like the patriarchy and class disparities, etc. One thing I was particularly interested in was a commentary about plastic surgery, especially its prevalence in Korea, and like the debt that women go into to get it. I thought that was really interesting. They talked about that quite a lot in this book. I was also really interested in Kyuri's experience as like a room salon girl, which like to my understanding is like prostitution. I could be a little bit wrong with that, but that's what it sounded like throughout this book. And I knew nothing about that before reading this. But I feel like all of this and the whole book ultimately led to nothing, which feels a little harsh to say, but like when I got to the last page of this book, I was just like, what? That's it? Like, it feels like there wasn't much of a plot going on. Like, there were things that happened, and like usually that leads to some moment of like conflict or some greater growing of the characters or something. But it just didn't do anything in this book. I can't even say it was like a character study because it feels like the characters weren't really fleshed out except for like Kyuri. Yeah, I just didn't really get it. I got to the end of the book and I was just like, that's it? That's pretty much summarizes my feelings on this book. So while I liked it in the beginning, I will say it left like a lot to be desired, and I gave it 3 stars. Beautiful cover though, love the cover. And then the last 4 books I read in January were all part of a reading vlog, which will be out soon. So I'm not going to give you my thoughts. I'm just going to give you a quick summary, and we'll move past this pretty quick. I do have to grab them, though. So the first of those books is Assistant to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer. This book follows... Oh, God, this book follows a girl named Evie who starts to work for like this notorious villain. She's his assistant to the villain. She's in love with him also, and that's like a big part of the book. But essentially, plot-wise, the only thing that happens is she's working for this villain, and they find out that someone's like a traitor in their midst, and they have to figure out who it is. That's it. I can kind of tell my feelings about this book is the way I'm talking about it. The next book is The Foxglove King by Hannah Witten. This follows a girl who has like a death magic. So it takes place in a world where, first of all, people take poison recreationally. So at the beginning of the book, our main character is working as like working for a poison dealer. And she gets caught by the King's Guard. And so even though she doesn't use her magic like ever, she uses her magic in this one instance to try to get away. And she reanimates a dead horse as a distraction. And then she doesn't get away. And she gets captured. And they want to use her magic. And they also want her to spy on the prince because they believe that he's betraying them. Then we have Psyche and Eros by Luna McNamara. This book follows Psyche and Eros. It's a Greek retelling. Essentially, Psyche, before she was born, her father went to an oracle that said she would be this great hero. So as she's growing up, he's training her in like combat, archery, stuff like that. And then one day she slays this great beast, and everyone's giving her all these compliments, and someone makes a mistake of saying that she's as beautiful as Aphrodite. This gets Aphrodite jealous, so Aphrodite goes to Eros, which is the god of passion, and Eros has these like magical arrows where he can shoot someone and make them fall in love, and she places a cursed arrow in his, thing of arrows, and she asks him to shoot Psyche with it, and essentially the curse is that she will fall in love with the first person she sees, but she'll never be able to be with them. But while Eros is about to strike Psyche with his arrow, he accidentally scratches himself in it and falls in love with Psyche. And then the last book I read for that video is Throne of the Fallen by Carrie Maniscalco. This book is a hard one to describe. You're essentially following, first of all, Camilla, who's a human girl who is an artist, and she owns a gallery, and she's being blackmailed by this Lord Vexley, who basically caught her selling a forgery and now is like trying to get her to sell more so that he can profit off of it. And then you're also following Prince Envy, who's one of the 7 demons of hell. He's like, the demons of hell are named for the 7 deadly sins, so he's Prince Envy, the sin of envy. And he's playing this game to save his court that leads him to Camilla. And that's kind of the gist. So there you go. Those are all the books I read in January. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you read in January down below, and I'll see you soon with another video. Goodbye!